Greetings. My name's Tom Banshoff of Georgetown University, and I'm delighted to welcome you to a conversation that is part of our project on the culture of encounter and the global agenda, a year-long discussion and engagement with the key concept of Pope Francis, the culture of encounter, an exploration of the idea, but also the practice around the world. And I'm delighted to be joined by two participants in the project for a conversation today about some of the local and national dynamics. A lot of the project, which culminated this past year in a conference at Rome, was based on the global question, issues of global governance, international diplomacy, how they relate to the culture of encounter. But through the conversations we've had within the wider group, it's clear that there are many different local, national instantiations, understandings of the idea. And that's what we're going to explore today with my colleague, Paul Elie, who is a well-known author and cultural critic based like I am here at Georgetown University, and with Arinze Ifeakandu, who is a also well-known author and scholar who hails from Nigeria. So Paul, why don't you share some of your reflections? You wrote an essay on the topic, but it'd be great to hear your thoughts here in this context.
Thank you, Tom, and it's really a pleasure to be in conversation with you and with you, Arinze. It's great to see you again. The culture of encounter, this idea that got its strongest articulation in Francis's encyclical Fratelli Tutti, one of the things that strikes me about it, and that gives me such confidence in its prospects for the future, is that I have found the idea to be generative in my own work. The encyclical came out. Tom, you highlighted this theme of encounter within the encyclical. We had a discussion about it, and now I find that I aver to it and keep writing about it in ways hardly intending to do so. And that suggests just close to home the life that's in the idea, that it keeps generating and keeps yielding new things. So I wrote a piece for L'Osservatore Romano, a piece for Commonweal. I have a forthcoming piece in which I found myself trying to define the culture of encounter again. I put it, the piece is forthcoming this way. Pope Francis proposes that the church is for the culture of encounter, in which the human person is made whole through his or her face-to-face dealings with others of different backgrounds and outlooks, which creates a solidarity stronger than nationality, class, or ideology. And so that's my third or fourth way of putting it, I suppose. But the point I wish to bring out in the piece that's now posted in our Culture of Encounter series on the Berkeley Center site is that Francis is not coming up with a new idea so much as naming a circumstance that is already part of our life as thoughtful people oriented in some way towards Christianity over the past 50 years. We're often invited to speak as if the culture of our formation is kind of monolithic and totalizing, and then we go out into the world and encounter others. And in many respects, that was the case, let's say for Catholics growing up in the so-called Catholic ghetto in a century ago, or even 75 years ago in the United States. But for our generation, Tom, and then for your generation, Arinze, the experience of relative cultural diversity has been a kind of baseline for our lives, I would say. In religious terms, because of the Second Vatican Council, which concluded the year I was born, 1965, and which invited Catholics to be in what we now call encounters with people of other Christian bodies and other faiths. And then the cultural diversity created by what's now called globalization. So that in this suburb where I grew up, north of Albany, which is the capital of New York State, which is itself north of New York City, a fairly conventional suburb, not notable in any way for being, it's not thought of as a melting pot of diversity, and yet that was my experience. The people of different faiths, people of different ethnic backgrounds, people with very distinctive points of entry into the common life that we shared in that suburb, that we were all interacting. And the details of that are given in the essay. Christians, Jews, Hindus, Muslims, Black Americans, white Americans, people from South Asia, living together. I wouldn't say harmoniously, but everybody getting along, and not even reflecting too much on the fact of our diversity. What's significant about this? I think what the culture of encounter invites us to do is articulate and carry forth something that I want to say most of us have been doing for all our lives, which is encountering people whose outlooks are different from our own and being made whole or more whole in the process, and feeling a basic social solidarity that's stronger than nationality or ideology or class. That's the hope, and the very modest account of it from my own experience was just an attempt to correct the idea that this is either a new thing or a grand experiment. Rather, it's a naming of the experience of so many people, let's say over the past 50 years.
Thanks, Paul. And maybe a quick follow-up question. So your main point, drawing on the U.S. context, and we'll hear from Arinze as well, and this might look different in different national contexts around the world, is that at least for the last 50, 60 years, we've been living encounter, and that allows us to talk and reflect about encounter, not from nothing. We've already got some experience to draw on. I wonder if you could say a bit, and we've talked about this, about the opposite of encounter. One reason that encounter resonates so much today is the sense that we're living in a world of tension, division, conflict, polarization, and that encounter is an antidote to that, as a stance, an openness to the other, putting oneself in the shoes of the other. Can you reflect a little bit from our conversations? I know you're a bit skeptical of all this talk of this moment of division and polarization as being unprecedented. Can you say a little bit about that and how it relates to how you think about encounter today?
Yes, and it's a very good question. So when you say that I'm skeptical of this moment of division and polarization, it partly has to do with my sense, which is enforced by the sense of history that I get as an author working in cultural history and as a Catholic, that there's a great deal of strife in every era. The era between the world wars in Europe, fascists and phalangists and Nazis, there was plenty of polarization at that time. The strife that surrounded the emerging independence of the countries of Africa, it didn't happen in a placid or easy way. So I just think the imagining of some better, more placid age is an obstacle to clarity. Then, expanding on the point, I would say that, and I just came off a call with some people from Italy, so Italy is the country that I have in mind, but a lot of the divisions that are expressed in our political life have to do with attempts to control or roll back the relatively diverse culture that has emerged. Italy has more restrictive immigration policies than most countries, but the right wing there doesn't want Italians to have to encounter people from other cultures. It's already happening, and they're trying to push back against that. And I think what they're attempting is very dangerous and can have very practical effects, excluding immigrants from North Africa, let's say. But in the broader sense, the trend is toward greater mobility and therefore greater diversity, and the world is tending strongly in that direction. And so the strife that we see is an effort to almost deny that reality.
Thanks. Thanks. That's an optimistic way of looking at it, that the overall trend is toward greater diversity. And these are maybe, I'm putting words in your mouth, but rearguard actions that we're seeing in domestic politics in different countries.
Well, and so in Italy, for example, or let's say, when we switch to Hungary for a moment, they, the very leader who wants to maintain that Hungary is for Hungarians, he's now building all sorts of alliances with the global right, including with Governor DeSantis of Florida and so forth. So he while he despises one kind of diversity, he's using another kind of diversity, an international right-wing coalition, to further his aims. So there's a bit of a bait and switch, if you see what I mean. Hungary is for Hungarians, but he wants the global right to support Hungary in its narrow Hungary for Hungarians project.
Yeah, let's come back to some of those transnational dynamics which complicate the national debates. But first, Arinze, why don't you share some of your reflections based on your essay?
When I was thinking of the essay, I was like, my mind, it was, I think, around the time when they had, the shooter had gone to Uvalde. And so like there was also like, they had also, the Supreme Court had also like, taken out Roe v. Wade. And, I think, I don't know if it was for Roe v. Wade, but I read like the judgment or like what the reasoning behind it. And I was just like, I don't think this argument itself is just like, doesn't make sense. I'm to think that this is the kind of thinking that would come from like the highest point of sort of like, and I'm not even a lawyer. I'm like, this doesn't make sense, right? And so for me, it's sort of clarified something, which is that, a lot of that for so many of like, yes, in many ways, I with what Paul was saying earlier, that I sort of align with that, which is the sense that the world is moving towards greater diversity. And yet it seems to be like again and again at every step, at every age, conscious efforts by quite a good number of also the world's population to sort of hold on progress, to sort of move towards a kind of regressive living. And so that was what I saw in like all those things, like, children have been killed, and yet nobody, like, not everybody sort of ignoring, not everybody, of course, but like a lot of people in power are ignoring like the real issue, which is, all these issues, like from, whether it's about guns or like the rights of trans women or queer men or queer people, like, or women, and just sort of like the efforts of, conservatives everywhere, whether they're in Nigeria or they're in the United States, to sort of move people to less freedom, I would say. I think that's, for me, is one of the biggest impediments to that culture of encounter, because if we are trying to move towards like a more equitable world, and there are like not a negligible, like quite a good number of people in the world who, for some reason, I don't know, like, not that we don't know, we know these reasons, because if we could read like sort of the statement from the highest court and easily find like arguments that don't make sense, that are used to justify, these very like sort of horrible things that are going to be done to people, then it is not a question of like, I guess people not really knowing, but a question of like, it's like a kind of like psychological, I don't want to say gaslighting, because that's a word everybody now uses, like, but at a larger scale, right? And so I guess like for me, in thinking of, my reflections about encounter, again, like, yes, people usually say, sometimes people will say, oh yeah, the world, people these days are now so corrupt and so spoiled, and that that things used to be better before. But like sometimes I'm like, okay, do you want to live in 1960? Do you want to live in 1900? Like let's ask ourselves these questions and be honest. No, I don't think the answer will be yes for many people, right? So yes, I do see the sense in which like, and so that's where my point comes from. But then like there is also like huge efforts, conscious efforts to push towards sort of like regression. And I think my argument is like my thinking at least is that like there has to be again like that's sort of conscious efforts to preserve what has been fought for, because liberties are not, they don't just appear, they don't just like they're not just they're not just guaranteed. Like people across the world have always like fought for their interests, and sometimes some people's interests are just too self-centered and too selfish, and like not just self-centered and selfish, but also just very wicked in terms of like they wanting something for themselves and not wanting somebody else for some illogical reason not to have those same things. So like we have to be very conscious at, you know, at every, I still think that like in the next maybe 100 years there will be some new issues that even we were ignorant about, and there will be new conversations and like more progress will be gained. um and so like even as we sort of hold faith and say yes, as the world gets older, hopefully people will evolve into something better. We also have to be very aware that, you know, as we're learning, firstly there has to be some kind of open-mindedness, which is like, you know, yeah, you know, there are many things that perhaps we as a generation do not know, and that like, you know, is it intra-generational sort of conversations really need to happen, just as we're having a sort of like conversations also across class. And so when we're having conversations like this, are we looking at, you know, like what's, you know, what's, I guess, where is someone coming from? What's experience do they have? Um, so my point again, like when I think of like, you know, a lot of young people wanting easier lives, many people today, like, and the figures show this, that like young people now can, in the US at least, I know, like let's say 20, 30 years ago, like people in their 20s were having houses and families, and right now it's like a different, like it's a different thing. And a lot of that experience is economical. Um, and so these are things we also need to think about, like in terms of like how are people in the world, like not just feeling that, you know, of course, but you know, regarding race, sexuality, and all these things, but also like, you know, how, you know, money and like how much work, sort of the work-life balance that people have. Like I was in, you know, when I wrote that, I was in Florida, and you know, I was for many reasons I was sort of dissatisfied with the work-life balance that I had, and also like the kind of the pay. But then there were also a lot of people who I would interact with who were not like who were not in academia, who were not like also artists, who were just like regular people, who were people who worked like whether in banking or at Chick-fil-A or whatever. And it was just like the amount of hours that people had to put into work. And when I think of life as like this, you know, as this one thing that we have, like, you know, it's like you're born, you live, you die. I'm like, I don't think anybody has to work, like has to live their lives like in that, you know what I mean? Like, so I guess like for me, it's thinking about all these issues and like sort of trying to make sense of how do we move forward? How do we generally make people's lives easier? Like people's time here on earth, fun. And like, so whatever someone says, this is my, what is going to do, like, and like also have time to spend with their families and their friends, and also live the life that makes them most, you know, happy before death comes. So that's like my thinking around that. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. And there are, as you point out, all kinds of links between the idea of encounter, engagement with difference, and human flourishing more broadly. And I wonder if you might share some thoughts, building off your essay and the other contributions you've made to this project, about society in Nigeria as it relates to encounter. We heard from Paul the notion that there's a lot of encounter on the ground, that at the personal and community level in particular, people have learned to engage across religious lines, racial lines, maybe class lines, although we haven't talked about that much. And but that there's also political dynamic now in play in the United States and around the world, and perhaps also in Nigeria, which is pushing back on those processes of encounter. How does it look from Nigeria?
Yeah, so it was interesting because like when I was reading Paul's essay, like what he was describing was just like similar to like what my experience was, like, school with like, people from various backgrounds, various religious backgrounds at least, because I grew up in Kano and I went to a Catholic secondary school, but at school we had like Muslims, and my family is Anglican. So basically me, myself, I also had a different experience from like what like this, from the school's administration and sort of like the majority of the students, right? So it was like, and so it was like, we had these religious lines as well, and then we also had like, ethnic lines, which was like, had Hausa, Yoruba, Igbo, Calabar, people from all various parts of Nigeria. But something also was also clear, because also the school fees was also expensive. A lot of the people there, like at least we had like students who their parents were like politicians, well-known politicians, and like who came from money. And then we had those, their parents were like, Igbo businessmen who were just like struggling and being like, oh, my child has to have like the best education so that he can make big money in the next generation. And we also had, so it's like, and then the school also had this thing where they had a mission where like, so Christian, regardless of, irrespective of their denomination, so Christian Hausa people, I think from Kano, I'm not sure, but like Christian Hausa, in the north, because the north is like the predominant, like not predominantly, but like in terms of like political power, Muslim. So like Christian Hausa people in the north, and even sort of in terms of population, um, uh, who were farmers mostly in the villages, they would come to this really expensive school without payment. So like I think they would stay in the boarding house, and part of the payment was the way they paid was like their parents would sort of contribute like things like maize and like basically farm produce to the school kitchen, and so that would be in lieu of school fees. And so of course there were like also challenges that like with it, I don't think it wasn't a perfect system at all, but I think that was a conscious effort in a way to sort of make sure that there was a kind of balance. And and then coming to the United States and hearing people saying things like affirmative action, and it seemed like so righteous and something, and I'm like, this is a regular thing, you don't need to make a big deal about it, right? um so like I guess like that's part of like where a lot of my thing, I don't even know what if I answered the question, but I just like went off but yeah,
You did. You did. Yeah,
yeah.
you did. No, that's fascinating. And your experience both in the United States and Nigeria, I mean, lots of insights there. Paul, do you have any reflections on the conversation so far? Mhm.
Yes, and I'm grasping, I think, partly from something you said, Tom, and then certainly from what you've said, Arinze, that uh, it's important not to be too optimistic about the possibility for encounter. Um, a lot of people don't really want to encounter people unlike themselves. And then what are the reasons for that? I think what you mentioned about the need for so many people to work so many hours, Arinze, um, the racial so much with
We lost you there for a second.
okay,
Just
I'm sorry.
pick it up after the phrase "so many hours," and then you started again with racial. Just that sentence with racial.
So Arinze, you pointed out that so many people have to work so many hours just to sustain their lives. And this competition for the work just to support a simple way of life is such an obstacle to encounter. I think the racial politics in this country, United States and elsewhere, have to do partly with culture. They partly have to do with a wish to preserve an identity, but they have a lot to do with simple competition for work, for money, for goods. And that's, to go back to my earlier example, people in Italy who resist immigration don't simply want to preserve a pure Italian way of life. They're afraid that if many people from North Africa come willing to work very hard, that the Italians will have to work harder or they will get less. Everybody wants more than they've got, and there's maybe not enough to go around. So we see conflict as a result.
Thanks, Paul. Arinze, could you say a bit, you've written very eloquently about issues of sexual orientation, identity along different personal dimensions. Maybe some of your experience there, because when we think of encounter, we tend to think of a continuum of recognition of the other as a human being along all these dimensions we've talked about, including sexual orientation, for example. But sexual orientation is so contested within religious communities, within national communities. It's so context bound that perhaps it's hard to think about it as a universal right to be pursued universally. We have to be attentive to the context in which we can push that freedom agenda. Could you talk a little bit about those dynamics, since you've written so eloquently about them?
Yeah, so I'm trying to, could you like ask the question again, but like I'm trying to remember what the first things were.
Yeah, sort of encounter and openness to the other, and the special challenges posed by issues of gender and sexual orientation, and some of your own experiences with that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. So sometimes something happens where like my friends, like some of my friends will be having a conversation and like maybe someone would say, oh, this was something like this happened. And someone would say, oh my God, that's so homophobic. And someone else would say, oh, that's misogynistic. I think, but it's like, but then you look at it, yes, it's homophobic and, misogynistic, right? And so like in my experience, I grew up like when I was, at least for my earliest memories of myself, I was a feminine boy, like, and when I was in primary school, I didn't get any issues about it. Like it was just who I was. It was Arinze, and it was fine. And then when we played, house, sometimes I would like tie like, my mom's hair tie and like, and it was just fun. Like it was just, and there was no bullying, no judgment. It was just who I was. And then I went off to secondary school. My first secondary school was an Anglican secondary school in Oka, which is Eastern Nigeria. I stayed there for a year and a term before my mom took me out because the teachers were really just like flogging is part of teaching in general in Nigeria, but like it varies from school to school. That particular school, they had no moderation. And it was an Anglican boarding school, and that was where I first saw like homophobia, like, really, which was where like feminine boys were sort of like basically catcalled and ridiculed, and the school itself, the school administration would like. I remember then there was a time the chaplain would say he doesn't want to see two boys holding hands, and this was like boys who were like 10, 11, 13, some who were 16, and like boys hold hands, boys rough house, boys cuddle, like it's not a big deal. Like these are children who are away from home, from their fathers and sisters and mothers, and you're saying that like you're already sexualizing like their like experiences with each other, their ways of bonding or or forming connection. And so like, and that was homophobic in itself. And I don't think, and so that for me, that's like the fact that like, and then of course I went to this other school where nobody gave me any issues until like much later. And then the bullying that came was something, I've talked about and I, gone past now, but like it felt different, right? It was still the bullying, regarding, oh, you girly boy, I don't want it to be girly and stuff. And it was, and so like that's the fact that like, a boy cannot be like a girl. What does that even mean, right? So now I ask my friends, who is Arinze, right? If I try to catwalk down the street, I feel ridiculous, and yet like I still a very feminine man in many ways, right? Um, and so I know that my experiences have made me who I am today, and like whether I catwalk down the street or not, like this is who I am now, or this is who I am, right? But like I often go back to the thoughts, like to the very beginning of like, does who is the real person? Are you most real before the world like sort of strangles something out of you? So who would I have been if I didn't like if I didn't get bullied, or if I didn't see other people get bullied for being feminine, other boys get bullied, or get bullied for being feminine? How would I present if, the first time I got a phone and like looked through, I began to go on gay forums, if I didn't see a bunch of gay men in their 30s and 40s and like mid 20s saying things like, oh, if I wanted a man, if I wanted a girl, I would go for a real girl. Like, like things like that. Like, who would I be? Like, so, and I'm not saying this as to say, oh, there's some kind of regret as to who I am now. No, it's all part of my experience. But like, it's just to sort of pose that question and, what do we do to human beings, not just gay boys, but also to girls, because like, there are also like all these experiences, and it's, yeah, that's how I've been thinking about it. Yeah.
Well, thank you. I mean, it's such a multi-layered set of issues, and your experiences are inspiring. And as you say, raise a lot of questions of what might have been, right? Had we grown up, or should we grow up in different cultural circumstances? As we draw our conversation to a close, Paul, maybe we could continue on this theme of gender and sexual orientation as a dimension of difference in human encounter. You've written extensively about the church, as you referenced. You've followed debates within the church. Yes, we've grown up in the church in the United States, especially in progressive circles, in the context of an open engagement with difference. And encounter is a way, as you say, of putting words on what we've experienced. But of course, issues of sexual orientation and gender raise particular problems for many within the church. Could you say something about those challenges and where you see them going?
Yes, thank you. Let me begin with something from Arinze's essay. You tell a poignant story of some sense of your sexual difference or orientation, and not till the age 23 are you able to discuss it with the vicar in your church, at which point you say, we have listened to your sermons all our lives, now it is time for you to listen to us. I guess winding it back to my initial conviction about encounter, which is something that we've been doing, let's say for 50 or 60 years, even if it hasn't been acknowledged, I think there's an analogous experience when we talk about homosexuality, that essentially most reliable studies or data suggest that a certain part of the population is gay. And the question isn't whether they're gay or not, it's whether that is openly acknowledged or discussed. But so I can think of half a dozen people in my own life whom I've been encountering for 40 or 50 years. They've been gay all along, and it's just in the last 10 years that we've discussed that openly. But I have been encountering them for as long as we've known each other. So even the most conservative Christians at this point aren't signing on to conversion therapy. No one is suggesting that homosexuality is going to go away, or that individual gay people in large numbers can if your being can be done away with. So we are going to encounter gay people. Those of us who are not gay, it's just that encounter with gay people is part of our everyday dealings, whether it's acknowledged or not. So the challenge for Christianity is, in what ways should it be acknowledged? How articulate about that encounter can we be? What sorts of recognition can we give to a way of being that simply exists? Does this speak at all to your understanding of things, Arinze?
Yes, like in many ways it does. So there's this the this man, he was one time the Archbishop of Canterbury. I think it's Williams Rowan or Rowan's William. And like, he was Archbishop at the time when the debate was really hot, like what just basically the global Anglicans and like the West African Anglicans and stuff. Like there was this tussle, and just like I could tell from the interviews I'd watched and some of the things he had written that he was like, if he could, he would just be like gay rights, marriage equality, like the church, like gay bishops, but he was a leader, and like he and I think he was thinking, from what I got, was like part of his responsibility was to sort of hold this sort of fragile thing together. And I sort of identified with, like, not identified, but I sort of empathized with some of that. But then also, like, as I got older and saw a lot more carnage, like maybe carnage is a heavy word, but like saw a lot more tragedies, like just people getting like the homophobic experiences, which I also like in the piece. I just got really dissatisfied, and I was like, I mean, if someone has power, like I want them to sort of just make all the pain go away. And yet I understand like that it is more complicated than that, right? And again, it goes back to what like Paul you've written about, which is that like basically the people decide what the doctrine is in many ways. Maybe I'm making it too literal, but the church doesn't just dictate what the teachings are. Part of like what the thinking of the people also sort of gets, moves into what like the doctrine is. And so I'm thinking that like, and part of what I also told my priest in that conversation was that, that there are a lot of people like my age mates, my friends who, in the parish, the diocese had to go do like, they called it Youth Church of Pentecost, because young people were in the Anglican church a lot. Music was old and boring, and this was not even, it was like, and so they wanted to do their own music, and because people in the church were like, no, and so they had to do a different parish for young people. I told him, see, very soon you would have this same problem again, because and it wouldn't be because of like the music, it would be because people were like, you can't treat my friend poorly and you expect me to sit in this pew, right? And very soon, like, it's going to be there from the choir to the pews. So like, and it's not just even, nobody has to do anything about, like, for that to happen. That's how time works. It's just going to happen. And so like, what then does the church have to do in many ways? Like I see, not only because, for two things, to preserve itself, because that is important, right? And why is that preservation like necessary? There's also like various churches, there are like many ways in which churches have like just caused a lot of pain, but there are also many ways in which churches function as like churches are necessary in a sense, for community and sort of social life, and a lot of people need some kind of spiritual center in their lives. But then like it's going to be a loss to the church and to people who need the church as well, if there isn't real thinking and real conversations, like honest ones that are geared towards repair and just healing, I guess.
Thank you, Arinze, and thank you, Paul. I think this last part of the conversation is a fitting way to wrap things up. We began talking about the United States and Nigeria. very quickly shifted to personal experiences of encounter, difficult dimensions of encounter, including issues of sexual orientation and gender, and came back not to the national level, but to the level of a key social institution, the church, which is struggling in so many ways to be a place of encounter in keeping with the gospel, to be open, and yet, as you put it so beautifully, Arinze, to be a structure as well with hierarchy and tradition, and to navigate that path. So these are some of the key themes we'll continue to explore in the Culture of Encounter project, and I want to thank you both for joining me for this conversation.